It was past midnight when former soldier Jack Carter and his loyal dog Rex walked the silent hospital corridor. The world outside was asleep, but inside, a faint beep echoed, the fragile rhythm of a child's heartbeat barely holding on. Through the dim light, Jack saw a woman leaning over a small girl's bedside, her hand pressing a syringe into the IV line. In that still, frozen moment, Rex growled, low, warning, alive, as if he could sense the very breath of danger. What happened next would test courage, uncover deception, and remind us that sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. They walk quietly among us. Stay with us until the end of this story, because what you're about to hear may change the way you see kindness forever. May your day be peaceful, and may goodness always find its way back to you. It was the heart of winter in Denver, the kind that silenced streets beneath a veil of white and turned breath into mist. Inside the private pediatric hospital of St. Aurora, the night hummed with that peculiar stillness only hospitals know, machines breathing for the sick, walls holding the hush of unspoken prayers. In the dim corridor light, Jack Carter moved with the quiet steadiness of habit, a man who had long learned to listen to silence. 42 years old, his frame still carried the imprint of military discipline. Broad-shouldered, olive-green jacket zipped halfway, the silver glint of a dog tag hidden beneath the fabric. His dark hair was cut short, peppered with gray, and his face bore the calm fatigue of someone who had seen both the cruelty and the grace of humankind. Beside him walked Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd, his coat a ripple of black and tan with a saddle marking as dark as midnight and eyes the color of amber glass. The dog's steps made no sound on the linoleum floor, his head level, ears alert, as though he too understood the gravity of places like this. Jack's rounds through the children's ward were simple, quiet work, the kind he preferred. No gunfire, no desert winds, just the mechanical pulse of heart monitors and the soft murmur of nurses behind glass doors. Yet tonight, something in the air felt different, too still, too suspended between warmth and unease. Snow pressed against the windows in muted gusts. He paused near room 212, where a faint, uneven beeping reached his ear. Inside, the sterile light glowed blue against the white sheets, and a small figure lay motionless beneath them. Emily Hayes, 5 years old, tiny even for her age, a cast on her right leg hanging in traction. Her face was pale, the kind of fragile pallor that made her seem made of porcelain rather than flesh. Wisps of honey-brown hair curled near her temples, and her lashes, long and feather-soft, trembled against her cheeks as she dreamed. The heart monitor beside her traced slow, hesitant waves. Rex stopped first. The dog's body stiffened, one paw lifted in mid-step, nostrils flaring. Jack followed his gaze. A woman stood near the bed, her back turned, the hem of a cream-colored coat brushing her knees. The movement of her arm was delicate, deliberate, as she adjusted the line of an IV drip. The syringe in her hand glinted under the fluorescent light, clear liquid, no label. For a heartbeat, nothing existed but that quiet act and the low hum of machinery. Then, Rex let out a single low growl that rolled through the room like a warning from something ancient and certain. The woman froze, her hand halfway between motion and guilt. Jack's voice broke the tension, low but edged with authority. "Ma'am, visiting hours ended an hour ago." She turned, and for a moment, everything about her seemed perfectly composed. Clara Hayes, mid-30s, tall, impeccably dressed, beauty polished to precision. Her blonde hair gleamed like fine silk, and her smile carried the effortless warmth of someone who knew how to use it. "Oh, Officer Carter," she said lightly, though he'd corrected that title a dozen times before. "I'm just saying goodnight to my stepdaughter. She gets anxious without me." The word stepdaughter lingered, cold and careful. Jack nodded once, stepping closer. Rex's growl faded into a watchful silence, but his eyes never left her hands. Clara brushed a strand of hair from Emily's forehead, the gesture tender but rehearsed. "Poor thing," she murmured, "always so delicate." Her perfume, something sharp, floral, cut through the faint scent of antiseptic. Jack noticed a faint dark smear on her right wrist, just above the glove line. Not dirt, not ink, something darker, like a bruise or residue of something she'd tried to wash away. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked quietly. She blinked, then smiled again, too quickly. "Of course. Long day, that's all." She patted the child's blanket once, too firmly, then turned to leave. The heart monitor began to race. 80, 100, 130. Jack's gaze shot to the screen. Emily stirred, her small fingers twitching, her lips parting soundlessly. Her eyes flickered open for a second, wide, unfocused, then closed again. Clara turned in the doorway, feigning calm. "She's always been dramatic when she dreams," she said, her voice light, but her hand tightening around her purse strap. Rex growled again, deeper this time, the fur along his spine rising like a living ridge. Jack's instincts, those same instincts that had once saved him in Kandahar, flared awake. Something was wrong. A nurse appeared at the far end of the corridor, drawn by the rising alarm. She was slender, mid-40s, streaks of silver through dark hair, her face composed in professional calm. "Everything okay here?" she asked, approaching with a clipboard. Her badge read, "Dr. Nora Grant." Jack stepped aside as she checked the monitor, frowning at the spike. "She shouldn't be reacting like this," Nora murmured. "The sedative's mild. No reason for her pulse to jump." Her eyes flicked toward Clara. "You said she was just resting, Mrs. Hayes?" "Of course," Clara replied, too smoothly. "Perhaps she's just excited to see her dog friend again." The sarcasm was brittle, coated in sugar. Nora's gaze lingered on the IV line, then on Clara's hand. "You didn't adjust her medication, did you?" The question was gentle, but Clara's shoulders stiffened. "Doctor, I'm not in the habit of touching hospital equipment." Jack could feel the invisible tug of hostility between the two women, the way truth hung unsaid in the sterile air. He cleared his throat. "Let's give the little one some rest," he said softly. "Ma'am, visiting hours are over." Clara hesitated, then exhaled as though weary of misunderstanding. "Very well. Good night, Emily," she said, leaning close to kiss the child's cheek. Rex growled once more, low but sharp, and Clara flinched before forcing a smile. Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking softly against the tile, perfume trailing behind her like a signature. When she was gone, the corridor fell quiet again. Nora adjusted the monitor, her brows drawn together. "Strange," she murmured. "The bruising on her arms doesn't match a fall. Some are older, fading, different depths. Have you noticed, Jack?" He nodded. "Yeah, I've seen too many accidents to call this one that." Their voices dropped as they stepped into the hall. "The father's a wealthy man," Nora added softly. "Arthur Hayes. Donations, influence, you name it. Everyone treads carefully." Jack looked through the glass at the sleeping child. "Careful," he repeated. "That's how people get hurt." Rex settled by the bed, his head on his paws, amber eyes never straying from the small figure beneath the blanket. The machine steadied again, 85 beats per minute, fragile but holding. Jack lingered at the doorway, his breath fogging faintly in the cold light. Through the glass, Emily looked peaceful again, though her tiny hand still clenched the edge of the blanket as if fighting off invisible fears. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're safe now, kiddo. We've got you." The snow outside pressed harder against the windows, soft flakes sliding down like whispers. Somewhere down the corridor, a clock struck midnight, its chime echoing faintly against the sterile walls. Jack adjusted his jacket collar, the olive fabric catching the blue reflection of the monitors. He'd spent years in war zones learning that danger didn't always arrive with noise. It sometimes came wrapped in perfume and silk smiles. He turned to Nora. "If something's off, I'll find it." She nodded once, the kind of acknowledgement that carried more faith than words. When he returned to his station, the security cameras flickered softly on the screens before him, each rectangle filled with still corridors, quiet rooms, the hum of machines keeping fragile lives afloat. Only room 212 drew his eyes again and again, the faint outline of a small figure, the steady pulse of green light marking life's fragile rhythm. Rex lifted his head at the sound of distant footsteps, then lay down again, his ears twitching at every faint noise. Jack watched the IV bag under the dim light, its surface glimmered faintly, a drop forming, falling, steady as a heartbeat. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling deep in his shoulders, but sleep was out of reach. That smear on Clara's wrist, the sudden spike in Emily's pulse, the dog's instinctive growl, it all pieced together into a silence that refused to fade. Outside, the storm had thickened, wrapping the hospital in white solitude. Inside, beneath that artificial calm, something darker waited, silent, but breathing. Jack looked once more at the glowing monitor, its faint pulse reflected in his eyes, and in the quiet rhythm of that sound, he made himself a silent promise. He would find the truth, no matter how quietly it tried to hide. Morning came slowly to St. Aurora, with the pale winter sun filtering weakly through the hospital blinds, casting stripes of light across the quiet ward. The snow outside had softened into slush, but the air still carried that thin, biting chill that never quite left the city in February. Jack Carter had been awake since before dawn, sitting at the small desk in the security office, a lukewarm cup of coffee untouched beside him. He scrolled through the hospital's internal reports, his jaw tightening as the cursor blinked over the one marked Incident Pediatric Ward, Patient Emily Hayes. The report was short, insultingly short. 3 sentences, clean and clinical, filed under accidental fall. There was no witness name, no detailed notes, no attending physician's remarks, and at the bottom, the signature in elegant cursive, Clara M. Hayes. His thumb brushed the edge of the page as though testing its reality. The woman had signed her own report. That, he thought, wasn't protocol. The coffee tasted bitter as he stood and crossed to the window, the steam from the vents fogging the glass. Down below, nurses hurried through the courtyard, heads bent against the cold, their coats whipping in the wind. The hospital looked serene from this distance, but Jack had lived long enough to know how silence could mask rot. The memory of the night before clung to him, the quickening heartbeat on the monitor, the faint smear on Clara's wrist, the way Rex had stood guard beside the little girl as though shielding her from a shadow no one else could see. He reached down, absently running a hand over Rex's head. The dog leaned into the touch, his amber eyes tracking the corridor beyond the door. "Something's off," Jack muttered. "You know it too, don't you?" Rex gave a low huff, the kind of sound that felt like agreement. By mid-morning, Jack found himself in the pediatric wing again, drawn by a pull he didn't bother resisting. The floor smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm milk. Dr. Nora Grant stood near the nurse's station, her hair tied back loosely, fatigue softening her otherwise steady expression. She looked up when she saw him. "Couldn't stay away, could you?" she said quietly, handing him a chart. He skimmed the pages, eyes narrowing at the medical entries. The bruises were mapped in small black circles, arms, shoulders, even near the ribs, some faded, some fresh. Nora spoke softly, as if afraid the walls could listen. "They're appearing in cycles," she said, "old ones fading, new ones forming. And they don't match the story of a fall." Her voice lowered further. "If this were a normal case, I'd file a report immediately. But you know who her family is." Jack's jaw tightened. "Arthur Hayes," he said, the name heavy on his tongue. He'd seen the man in magazines before, a polished face, sharp suits, articles about philanthropy and investment, but men like that often built empires. On silence. "I need to talk to him," Jack said. Nora hesitated, then nodded toward the elevator. "He's in the private lounge upstairs. Don't expect much." He thanked her with a nod and turned away, Rex pacing at his side, nails tapping softly against the tile. The executive lounge smelled of polished wood and money. Arthur Hayes sat by the window, a phone pressed to his ear, his posture straight, precise, his expression unbothered. Mid-50s, handsome in that ageless, sculpted way of men who had assistants to manage their flaws. His tailored gray suit fit like armor, every line deliberate. When Jack cleared his throat, Arthur ended the call without looking up. "Security concerns?" His tone was cordial but hollow. Jack met his gaze. "I'm reviewing your daughter's accident report. There are discrepancies." Arthur leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. "You're the night guard, aren't you? Or was it the dog handler? Forgive me, there are so many staff members here." The condescension landed like frost. Jack's voice stayed level. "I served in the military for 15 years. I know the difference between an accident and something else." Arthur's eyes flicked up then, sharp and cold. "You're paid to watch doors, not diagnose families," he said. Don't overstep. Jack held his ground. Then maybe you should ask yourself why your daughter flinches in her sleep. The words hung between them, heavy and sharp. Arthur's jaw worked once before he turned away. That will be all, Mr. Carter. I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter. Jack said nothing more. He'd seen this kind of man before, the kind who believed influence could erase truth. He left the lounge, the door closing behind him with a soft, decisive click that sounded too much like dismissal. Back in the ward, Rex was restless, his tail flicked once, twice, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Jack followed his lead to the end of the hallway, where a small cabinet stood beside the nurse's supply cart. The scent of antiseptic was sharp, but Rex's reaction wasn't to that. His ears flattened, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The cabinet door bore a discreet nameplate, C. Hayes, Personal Medical Storage. Jack glanced down the corridor. Empty. He crouched beside Rex, whispering, "Easy, boy." But the shepherd's gaze stayed fixed on the handle, his body tense, every muscle straining forward. Curiosity edged into suspicion. Jack looked over his shoulder once, then reached for the latch. It gave easily under his hand. Inside were neatly arranged medical supplies, sterile gloves, a small travel case, a few labeled vials. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary. But then he saw it. One used syringe, capped but stained faintly yellow at the tip, tucked beneath a folded towel. And beside it, a small bottle with its label peeling slightly. A sedative brand name carefully pasted over another. Chemical base. Jack picked it up, holding it to the light. The texture of the paper told him everything. Someone had replaced the label. "What the hell is this?" he murmured. The sound of footsteps down the hall snapped him back. He closed the cabinet quickly, slipping the syringe and bottle into a small evidence pouch he carried by habit. Rex stood rigid, ears pricked. A nurse passed by without noticing. When she turned the corner, Jack exhaled slowly, the cold air burning his lungs. He'd handled enough investigations overseas to know the difference between coincidence and intent. But here, without a warrant, without authority, he had nothing but instinct and a growing certainty that the truth was darker than anyone dared say aloud. He called an old number from his pocket notebook, one he hadn't used in years. The line crackled before a familiar voice answered. "Carter? Damn, it's been ages." It was Frank Donovan, a retired detective now consulting for the Denver Police Department. Jack explained quickly, carefully. The silence on the other end stretched before Frank sighed. "You're walking on thin ice, Jack. The Hayes family, big donors, deep ties. You accuse them without proof they'll bury you and your dog before sundown." Jack's tone didn't waver. "A little girl's getting hurt. You want me to wait for a body bag?" Frank exhaled again, quieter this time. "I'm telling you this as a friend. Unless you've got hard evidence, lab results, video, anything, don't touch it. Not yet." Then the line went dead. Jack stood for a long moment, phone still in his hand, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the silence. He felt that old ache in his chest, the same mix of frustration and helplessness he'd known on nights when rescue came too late. Rex pressed against his leg, the dog's steady warmth grounding him. He knelt, resting a hand on Rex's broad shoulder. "They think silence makes them untouchable," he said softly, "but silence doesn't last forever." The dog's amber eyes met his, calm and unwavering. Somewhere inside Jack, the weariness began to harden into resolve. He walked back to the security office, placed the pouch on the desk, and stared at it. The evidence sat there, small, almost meaningless without context. But he knew its weight. The city outside had brightened into a pale gray noon, snow melting into puddles that reflected the hospital's tall glass windows. Jack leaned back in his chair, feeling the cold metal of his badge beneath his jacket. For years he'd promised himself he was done fighting battles that weren't his. But sometimes, fate had a cruel sense of irony. It placed you right where you were needed most, even if no one asked. He switched on the camera feed, eyes drawn once again to the small room where the child slept. The monitor pulsed steadily, a fragile reminder that life could still endure the carelessness of those who claimed to protect it. Jack's reflection stared back at him in the dark screen, the lines on his face deeper than they had been yesterday. Outside, the wind howled softly against the windows, carrying the echo of a vow he didn't remember making, but now could no longer break. Whatever the cost, he would not look away again. The days that followed carried the slow rhythm of repetition, monitors beeping, nurses whispering, snow falling against the windows. But beneath that pattern, something shifted, something unseen but felt. Jack Carter had begun to notice the smallest things, the way nurses avoided room 212 after dusk, the way Clara Hayes arrived each evening with a soft smile and a faint tremor in her hands, always insisting that no one disturb Emily during their special time. Her voice was gentle, almost tender, yet her eyes moved like those of someone constantly measuring a lie. The staff obeyed her, of course. Money smoothed the way for privacy. But to Jack, each evening visit settled over the ward like a fog that refused to lift. Rex always sensed her before she appeared. The German shepherd would rise from his spot near the nurse's desk, his ears stiff, body coiled tight with a quiet warning. No one else heard it, that low vibration that rolled in his chest when Clara walked the corridor, her heels clicking with a rhythm that broke the hush of the floor. The dog's instincts were unrelenting, his eyes fixed on her every motion, his tail rigid, and his growl restrained only by Jack's hand on his collar. Emily, even in her half-conscious state, reacted too. The monitors betrayed what her small voice could not. Her pulse would leap, the line on the screen jittering wildly as though fear itself had a heartbeat. Jack tried to reason it away at first. Perhaps the child simply woke at unfamiliar sounds, but the pattern repeated with uncanny precision. Every night at the same hour, the same reaction. Clara would hum softly, touching the child's hair, adjusting the blanket with those perfectly manicured fingers. She'd always dim the lights a little more than necessary, turning the room into a fragile twilight. Then, after a while, she'd emerge, serene and polite, thanking the nurses for their care. And every time, Rex's growl lingered in the air long after she had gone, like an echo of truth that no one wanted to hear. Dr. Nora Grant noticed it too. She met Jack one evening in the break room, fatigue etched around her eyes. The coffee between them went cold as she spoke, her tone careful, restrained. "Her bruises aren't accidental, Jack," she said quietly. "They're patterned, some healing, some new. It's like someone's controlling the injuries over time." Jack's knuckles tightened around the cup. "You think it's her?" Nora exhaled. "I think someone wants the child to stay sick. The labs from the last week showed traces of a compound, something synthetic, neurological, low-dose exposure, but consistent." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "If I didn't know better, I'd say it was designed to mimic natural illness." That night, as snow piled high outside the hospital, Jack leaned against the doorway of room 212 and watched Clara through the glass. She sat by the bed, her back straight, her hand tracing circles on the blanket while murmuring to herself, her lips moving in soft rhythm. Rex stood beside Jack, silent but watchful, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something human ears couldn't perceive. Jack's instincts screamed caution, but instinct wasn't enough anymore. He needed proof, something the world couldn't dismiss as paranoia. He met Nora in her office after Clara had left, the room lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The walls were lined with medical charts and a shelf of children's drawings. "If we're right," Jack said quietly, "she's poisoning that kid a drop at a time." Nora nodded, "And we'll never stop her unless we catch her in the act." The pause that followed carried more weight than any argument. Jack looked at the small black device on her desk, a micro-surveillance camera the size of a coin. "Can you install it?" She hesitated only for a moment, then exhaled. "If it keeps the girl safe, yes." Later that evening, when the corridors had emptied and the hum of machines filled the silence, Nora entered room 212 with the careful composure of routine. Jack waited outside, keeping watch while she worked. The camera was hidden behind a small vent near the ceiling, angled toward the bed and IV stand. To anyone else, it was invisible, just another piece of hospital machinery. When she stepped out, she handed Jack a small remote device, no larger than a matchbox. "It'll record motion," she whispered. "We'll have our answer by morning." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of what they had set in motion. The following night unfolded with dreadful predictability. Clara arrived just past midnight, draped in her usual elegance, her coat collar trimmed in fur, her perfume sharp enough to sting the air. She greeted the nurses with her rehearsed warmth, then entered Emily's room and closed the door. Jack watched from the security office, eyes on the small live feed screen that flickered in black and white. For several minutes, nothing happened, just Clara sitting beside the bed, stroking the child's hair. Then she reached into her purse. His breath caught. She produced a small syringe, its contents clear as water, the needle glinting under the pale light. With unnerving precision, she pierced the IV line and pressed the plunger slowly, her expression calm, almost serene. When she withdrew the syringe, she smiled faintly, brushing Emily's cheek before leaning back in the chair as though nothing had happened. Jack's hand froze on the edge of the desk. The hum of the monitors filled the room, the faint static from the feed mingling with his own pulse. Rage, disbelief, and a deep cold horror collided in his chest. He had seen cruelty before, on battlefields, in cities torn apart, but this was different. This was intimacy twisted into something monstrous. He rewound the footage, forcing himself to watch it again. Every gesture burned into memory. The delicate press of her thumb, the soft smile, the child's fingers twitching faintly as the liquid entered her veins. He shut off the feed before the image broke him. When Nora joined him minutes later, her face turned pale as she watched the same recording. "That's it," she whispered. "That's what I found traces of in her blood work." She pressed a trembling hand to her temple. "It's a neurotoxin, diluted enough to mimic natural decline. Over time, it would cause cardiac distress, seizures." Her voice faltered. "She's killing her slowly." Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the room spinning around him. "Then we stop her. Next time, we catch her in person." The plan came together in whispers and fragments. They would keep the discovery quiet, no reports, no alerts, until they could confront her with undeniable proof. Nora would continue her rounds as usual, checking Emily's vitals and drawing new samples, while Jack monitored the cameras each night. If Clara returned, they would be ready. But both knew the risk. If she suspected she was being watched, the girl's life could end before anyone reached the door. The responsibility weighed heavier than any weapon Jack had ever carried. As dawn crept through the blinds, Jack stood once more outside room 212. Emily slept, her breathing shallow but steady, her small hand resting on the stuffed bear someone had left beside her. The machine beside her emitted a slow, steady rhythm, proof of endurance, fragile but real. Rex lay near the doorway, eyes half closed, muscles still taut even in rest. Jack's gaze shifted to the IV bag, faintly glowing in the early light. Every drop that fell felt like a countdown, a measure of time between harm and salvation. He whispered to the sleeping child, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Hold on, kid," he said softly. "We'll end this soon." Behind him, the snow outside began to fall again, each flake catching the first light of morning. The world looked peaceful, almost kind, but Jack had stopped believing in appearances. In the stillness of that cold dawn, he understood that some wars never ended. They just changed their battlefields. The night settled thick over Denver, the kind of cold that silences even the wind. St. Aurora stood in that stillness like a frozen cathedral, lights dimmed, corridors hushed, every sound carrying further than it should. In the surveillance room, Jack Carter sat beside Rex, the glow of the monitors casting pale light over his face. The air smelled faintly of metal and disinfectant, the scent of long waiting. On the screen, the hallway leading to room 212 was still. The clock read 1:53 a.m., 7 minutes before the hour he had learned to fear. Nora was stationed near the nurse's desk, her posture calm, her eyes on the vitals feed that blinked faintly in front of her. They didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't hesitation. It was the kind of focus that lives right before danger arrives. Rex stirred first, lifting his head, ears angling toward the corridor beyond the glass. Jack followed the movement instinctively. The dog's breathing slowed, nostrils flaring, catching something only he could detect. The seconds dragged out. Then, faintly through the monitor's grain, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, slim, deliberate, shadow moving within shadow. Clara Hayes walked with her usual grace, wrapped in a wool coat the color of ash, gloved hands holding a small leather bag. In one of those hands gleamed a faint reflection, the outline of a small metal case. Her steps were soundless on the tile, as if she feared to wake the truth itself. Jack leaned forward, muscles tensing. "There she is," he murmured, more to Rex than to anyone else. The dog's body went rigid, tail low, an animal sculpted by instinct. Clara stopped outside room 212, looked down both ends of the corridor, and then slipped inside. The door closed with a sound too soft for the microphones to catch. Jack's pulse began its slow, steady climb. He adjusted the gain on the monitor, watching the room bloom into monochrome light. Clara moved like a ritualist, not a mother, placing her bag on the bedside table, taking out the small silver case, unfolding it with meticulous precision. Each motion was practiced, elegant, deliberate. She glanced once at the sleeping child, then toward the IV bag. Her face softened into something almost tender, but her eyes were void of warmth. Rex gave a low growl, barely audible, his body pressing closer to Jack's leg. The faint chemical tang reached even the sealed air of the room, acrid and artificial. Jack's hand brushed the dog's collar. "Not yet," he whispered. On screen, Clara unscrewed the cap from the small vial, drew a clear liquid into a syringe, and held it to the light as though admiring a work of art. Her lips moved in words no one could hear. Then she turned, reaching toward the IV line. The world seemed to narrow to that single motion, the gleam of the needle, the calm certainty of her hand, the fragile stillness of the child beneath her. At that exact moment, the heart monitor stuttered. A faint alarm began to rise, slow and insistent, a mechanical whisper becoming a scream. Nora's eyes widened at the nurse's station. "Room 212. She's triggering the monitor," she breathed. In the surveillance room, Jack's restraint snapped. Rex erupted with a guttural bark that tore through the silence, and Jack was already on his feet, the chair toppling behind him. The corridor stretched long before him, his boots striking the floor in hard, echoing rhythm. The alarms now screamed across the ward, light flashing red through the glass panels. Somewhere, a child began to cry. Inside room 212, chaos bloomed in the space of a breath. Clara's hand froze over the IV line as Rex burst through the doorway, his body a blur of motion, fur bristling, a growl tearing from his throat like thunder given form. She stumbled back, the syringe slipping from her fingers, rolling beneath the bed. Jack followed an instant later, the cold air rushing in with him, his voice cutting through the sound. "Step away from her!" Clara's eyes darted toward him, wild, unrecognizing, the mask of composure finally shattered. "You don't understand," she hissed, voice cracking with something between rage and despair. "She was never meant to live. She took everything from me." Jack moved before she could reach again for the case. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it away, but she fought like a trapped animal, her free hand clawing for the fallen syringe. The room filled with the metallic clatter of struggle, the monitors shrieking their mechanical panic. "Let go!" she screamed, trying to wrench free, but Jack's grip held firm. The syringe snapped between them, glass breaking, a droplet of clear fluid falling to the floor. When it hit the tile, a faint hiss rose, a thin, curling smoke like breath on dry ice. Nora appeared at the doorway just in time to see it, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, God!" she whispered, turning to shout down the hall. "Emergency response, room 212!" Clara twisted violently, striking Jack's shoulder with surprising strength. "She made him forget me!" she screamed, tears streaking the makeup from her face. "Arthur loved her mother, not me. Do you know what it's like to be invisible in your own home?" Her words came in ragged bursts, confession wrapped in madness. "That child, she's the ghost of everything I'll never have." Jack forced her back against the wall, pinning her wrist, voice low but steady. "You don't hurt a child to erase your pain." But she spat back, "She shouldn't exist." Her cry cracked like something breaking. Rex lunged when Clara tore free, his body hitting her with controlled precision, jaws locking onto her forearm. The sound was sharp, a mix of surprise and fury, as she stumbled to the ground, struggling against the weight of the dog holding her there. Jack moved quickly, securing her other arm, wrenching the metal case from her grasp. Nora knelt by the bed, checking Emily's vitals, her hands shaking as she adjusted the monitors. "Pulse steady," she murmured, relief fighting through her fear. The faint smoke from the spilled toxin still curled upward, twisting in the sterile air before fading. The acrid smell lingered, the odor of something chemical and cruel. Within minutes, the corridor filled with footsteps, nurses, security, the wail of approaching sirens outside. The calm veneer of the hospital shattered into motion. Jack stepped back, chest heaving, as two officers entered, their uniforms stark against the sterile walls. They moved quickly, taking control, handcuffing Clara as she continued to mutter fragments of her grievance, half confession, half lament. He said she looked like her mother. He never looked at me again. It was supposed to be simple. Her voice trailed into sobs that no longer sounded human. Rex stood motionless now, his jaw releasing only when Jack gave the quiet signal. Blood streaked the woman's sleeve where his teeth had held her, but his eyes stayed fixed on her face, unflinching. Jack knelt beside him, resting a hand on his neck. "Good boy," he said softly. The dog's tail gave a faint single twitch, the only break in his stillness. Around them, the storm of voices swelled, orders, calls, the crackle of radios, but for Jack, sound faded into distance. All that remained was the small, steady beeping of Emily's monitor. When the room finally cleared, Nora stood by the bed, her expression drawn but steady. "She's safe now," she said quietly. Jack nodded, though his eyes lingered on the floor where the broken syringe lay, its shards glinting like cruel stars. The scent of the toxin still stung the air, a reminder of how close death had crept. Outside, dawn was beginning to gray the horizon, the first light pushing through the hospital blinds. Jack took one last look at the small figure in the bed, breathing, alive, and felt a quiet exhaustion settle deep within him. The sirens faded into the distance as officers led Clara away, her voice a broken echo swallowed by the night. Jack turned toward Rex, whose gaze followed the stretcher as it disappeared around the corner. The dog's amber eyes reflected the cold light, steady and unwavering. Jack exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air of the corridor. "It's over," he murmured, though part of him knew that endings were never that simple. The only sound that remained was the rhythmic pulse of life from room 212, fragile, persistent, and miraculously still there. Morning came gray and cold over Denver, the sky still washed in the pale residue of night. The hospital stood in uneasy silence, its corridors littered with the echoes of what had happened just hours earlier. Officers moved with quiet precision through room 212, their gloves whispering against metal and glass as they collected evidence. The air still carried the faint sting of chemicals, a sterile scent that clung to the memory of fear. A forensic technician held the shattered syringe under the light, her breath visible in the morning chill. "Traces of neurotoxin," she murmured, her tone clinical, yet subdued. Another officer lifted the IV bag from its stand, sealing it carefully in a plastic sleeve. Under ultraviolet light, faint fingerprints bloomed across the surface, delicate whorls and lines unmistakably human. Clara Hayes' name, once spoken with admiration, now rested inside a report marked "Criminal Evidence, Attempted Homicide." Jack Carter watched from the hallway, arms folded across his chest, the olive jacket still stained faintly at the cuff where the struggle had brushed the floor. He said little. Words had no place here. Truth was already screaming loud enough in the quiet. Rex sat by his feet, tail unmoving, eyes tracking every motion inside the room. The dog's ears twitched when the officer snapped the bag shut, a small, sharp sound that punctuated the finality of proof. Jack felt no triumph, only the hollow ache of inevitability. Justice, when it came, never felt like victory. It was simply what was left after mercy had run out. Arthur Hayes arrived just past noon, escorted by two men in suits who looked like they had been summoned more for containment than protection. His face, once immaculate in its composure, now bore the gray pallor of disbelief. Mid-50s, tall, tailored, but aged decades in a single night. He said nothing as Nora met him in the hall, leading him toward the conference room where the security footage waited. Jack followed at a distance, silent, the sound of Rex's claws faint against the tile. The room was dim, blinds half drawn against the light, the only glow coming from the laptop screen. Nora pressed play, her hand trembling ever so slightly. Arthur watched without blinking. The grainy footage flickered to life. The sterile hospital room, the small sleeping figure, the woman in the wool coat drawing a syringe. When Clara leaned over the bed, her expression almost tender, something in him seemed to collapse inward. His lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. When the image of the struggle appeared, the smoke rising from the floor, his hands trembled violently. Nora reached out, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Enough," he whispered, his voice cracked like dry glass. For a moment the room held nothing but the hum of the laptop fan and the faint rhythm of his ragged breathing. Then Arthur covered his face with his hands. She was all I had left after losing her mother, he said hoarsely. And I let a stranger destroy her right in front of me. Jack stood behind him, the weight of those words pressing against every scar memory he carried. He wanted to offer comfort, but there was no sentence that could bridge such ruin. Arthur turned slowly, his eyes rimmed red, searching Jack's face. "You stopped her," he said softly, voice trembling. "You and the dog. You saved her." Jack shook his head. "We just did what anyone should have done." But Arthur's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said. "Most people would have looked away." Days passed and the hospital resumed its strange rhythm of normalcy. Reporters called, but their inquiries were deflected. Officially, the case was marked as an ongoing investigation. Unofficially, everyone in St. Aurora knew that something holy had been fought for within those walls. Emily's recovery was slow but steady. The toxins had weakened her, leaving her body fragile, her nights restless with dreams she couldn't remember but never escaped. Nora visited often, her presence soft and patient. She spoke to Emily in gentle tones, telling her about Rex's bravery, about how he refused to leave her side that night. Sometimes the little girl would smile faintly, as if hearing a story she almost believed but couldn't yet recall. Jack avoided the hospital corridors for a while. He told himself it was to give the staff space, but the truth was simpler. He needed distance to understand what survival really meant. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's expression at the end, rage curdling into regret, love warped by jealousy until it no longer recognized itself. Rex, however, seemed untouched by the weight of memory. The dog carried on with quiet loyalty, his eyes steady, his gait confident. To him, right and wrong were not philosophies, only instincts. Watching him, Jack sometimes wished humanity worked the same way. Spring arrived slowly, washing the city in a tentative warmth. The snow melted from the curbs and trees along the boulevard began to show pale green buds. One morning, Jack found himself walking through the hospital gardens, the leash in his hand loose as Rex trotted beside him. They stopped before a small building marked Children's Rehabilitation Wing. Through the glass doors, laughter drifted faintly, a rare sound that softened the air. Jack hesitated, then entered. Inside, the light was different, alive with color. Murals lined the walls, painted suns and forests made by small, hopeful hands. Emily was there, seated at a table near the window, drawing with a crayon clutched awkwardly in her healing hand. Her hair had grown longer, the pale gold strands catching sunlight like threads of silk. When she saw Rex, she froze for a moment, then her face lit with a smile that chased away months of shadows. "Rex?" she squealed, sliding off the chair. She ran, unsteady at first but determined, and threw her arms around the dog's neck. Rex stood still, accepting her embrace with a gentle patience that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. Jack felt something tighten in his throat as he watched her. Emily looked up at him then, her eyes wide, clear blue like the sky beyond the window. "Mr. Jack," she said softly, "is Rex my angel?" The question hung in the air, pure and unguarded. Jack crouched beside her, resting a hand on Rex's back. "No," he said after a moment, his voice quiet, warm. "Angels are the ones who protect what's right, even when no one sees them." She frowned slightly, thinking it over, then smiled again, the first unbroken smile since the day she arrived at St. Aurora. "Then you and Rex are angels," she whispered. Jack laughed softly, shaking his head, but he didn't argue. Outside, Arthur Hayes stood watching through the glass. He looked older still, his suit too formal for the moment, but his expression held a gentleness that hadn't been there before. Later, Jack would learn that Arthur had created a foundation in his daughter's name, the Emily Hope Foundation, a fund dedicated to helping children hurt by the people meant to protect them. It was his way of balancing the scales, of turning grief into something that might matter. He nodded once toward Jack in silent acknowledgement before walking away, leaving the sound of children's laughter trailing behind him. As the afternoon light faded, Jack sat on the bench outside, Rex resting beside him, the leash coiled loosely around his hand. The hospital hummed quietly behind them, life continuing in its fragile, relentless way. He watched a pair of doves take flight from the roof, their wings flashing pale in the sunlight. For the first time in a long while, he let himself breathe without the weight of vigilance. Some battles, he realized, didn't end in glory or recognition. They ended in peace, the quiet kind that no one wrote about but that stayed in the heart like a promise kept. He glanced down at Rex, who was watching the sky with the same calm intensity that had once saved a life. "You did good," Jack murmured, voice soft as the wind. The dog turned his head, eyes reflecting the gold of the setting sun, and for a moment the world felt whole again. Somewhere inside the hospital, a child laughed, a sound so pure it carried through the fading light like a benediction. Jack closed his eyes, letting that sound settle in the quiet space where memories used to ache, and knew that sometimes doing the right thing was enough. Sometimes the quietest moments reveal the truest strength of the human heart, not in the noise of applause, nor in the stories told, but in the unseen acts of kindness that hold the world together when no one is watching. There are people who walk among us, carrying their burdens in silence, choosing compassion over comfort and courage over recognition. They may never call themselves heroes, yet through them, light still finds its way into the darkest corners. If this story has touched you in some way, take a moment to share what it made you feel, your thoughts, your memories, your hope. And if you believe in goodness, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and let your kindness ripple further than words can reach. May God bless you, and may your days be gentle and full of grace.